Joining us now from Airbase, Georgia, is George Harrison. And George has been a CAF member for nearly 20 years. He's been actively flying CAF aircraft for about 15, including the one we're going to talk about now, the Fairchild PT-19. And George, why don't you give us a little background on the history of this airplane? It's really quite fascinating.
Well, this airplane was actually, of course, manufactured by Fairchild and was delivered to Moulton Field, Alabama in December of 1943. It was one of the original Tuskegee Airmen airplanes. They used the PT-19 for primary training, and this airplane was used for about 8 months. At that time, they replaced the PT-19s with the PT-17 Stearman, popularly known as Stearman. And some people say they replaced it because the PT-19 was just too easy to fly and didn't actually prepare the young aviators for the BT-13 as they moved on up to the more advanced airplanes. So it was declared surplus, purchased by a civilian at the end of World War II, owned by a variety of people, and we acquired the airplane. Commemorative Air Force acquired the airplane 13 years ago. We've been flying it ever since, and when we became aware of its history as an original Tuskegee airplane, we decided that it really needed to be restored and put in its original condition. So we spent 2 years stripping the airplane, replacing all the worn fabric, making sure that the airplane was completely airworthy. And I just flew it 2 weeks ago, its first flight in 2 years. And it's flying like a dream.
Let's talk a little bit about the history of the airplane with the Tuskegee Airmen and the role it played in training some of those pilots.
Well, of course, in Tuskegee, the Tuskegee experiment was a unique operation. It was a complete Air Force all by itself, consisting entirely of Black Americans, except for a few of the commanders, Noel Parrish being a notable exception. There was a really prejudiced belief in America at the time that black men could not fly airplanes, could not be taught to fly airplanes, which of course was complete hogwash, I guess is a good enough term.
Sure.
Complete garbage. So the Tuskegee experiment was set up. Some think that Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot to do with setting it up, but it was actually strongly along the way before Eleanor Roosevelt became aware of what was going on. Nevertheless, she did have a role in making sure that it continued and that it had a fair shake. So the Tuskegee Airmen operated, it was a complete flying school, primary, basic, and advanced training all the way through the T-6 and up to the fighter aircraft that they would later fly in combat. This airplane, of course, was the PT-19 was the primary airplane. It was the first airplane that a young man would fly. Now, these were highly selected young men, by the way. They all had advanced degrees. Most had gone through civilian pilot training in small, light aircraft, Piper Cub, Cessna, or Aranca Champion, those kinds of things. So they jumped in it, learned how to fly it. Such notable names as Ben Davis, retired and later retired as a lieutenant general, flew this kind of airplane, not necessarily this airplane. So it was, and in addition, not only did the pilots fly it, but black airmen maintained it. So we had black airmen who maintained the airplane, who flew the airplane, and who got the pilots and the maintainers ready to deploy and go to war, which they later did in Italy, by the way.
How did you discover that this airplane had the lineage back to the Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, we knew that the airplane obviously had been used by the Army Air Forces as a primary trainer, and one of our members, Kevin Corderud, took the initiative to go to the Air Force archives down at Maxwell Air Force Base and research the tail number of this airplane. And Kevin discovered that the airplane not only had flown in Moulton Field, Alabama, and was delivered to Moulton Field, Alabama as a Tuskegee Airman airplane, but it was probably delivered from the factory to Alabama by a female pilot. So we have a double chunk of history here. Flown by a WASP, a female pilot. Uh, and of course, you know the whole history of the Wasps, and that's probably not our subject today. But delivered by a Wasp, flown by black airmen, and then, of course, later flown by a variety of civilians as it went through and wended its way to the Commemorative Air Force.
So, do you know any specific Tuskegee Airmen who flew in this airplane?
We have a couple of names that probably flew the airplane, but we don't have anything nailed down enough to really say definitively this guy flew this airplane.
So now you talked about the process of restoring the airplane. About how long did the restoration take?
We spent 2 years restoring the airplane. We completely stripped the fabric. Of course, one of the unique things about this airplane, as with many trainers of its vintage, it was built from non-strategic materials. We've all heard the stories about scrap metal drives in World War II, shortage of aluminum and steel, those kinds of things. So the non-tactical airplanes were made out of non-strategic materials to the extent possible. The PT-19 had plywood wings, which is kind of an interesting sidelight. Turns out plywood is very strong, by the way, because of the way it's laminated and laid up. So when we restored the airplane, we wanted to make sure that there was no delamination. We wanted to make sure that the wood was structurally good. We didn't have any dry rot, any of those kinds of things. So the airplane was completely stripped down to bare metal and on the fuselage, and we stripped the wings and inspected inside the wings to make sure that we didn't have any animal infestation. As a matter of fact, several years ago, we restored the wings on another PT-19, and when we opened it up, we found out that a squirrel had lived in there for some long period of time and had eaten a couple of the stringers and formers inside the wing. So we wanted to make sure we had an intact set of wings and the airplane was structurally sound, and it is.
Now, did you have an opportunity to fly the airplane before it went into restoration?
Yeah, I flew it extensively before it was restored, and then, of course, flew it right after we finished the restoration. And that's what I'll fly this afternoon, as a matter of fact.
I was just going to say, and as soon as we finish the interview here, you're getting ready to go fly it some more,
Yeah.
which is great. And so for folks who don't know, you have a pretty extensive background in aviation. You were in the Air Force for a number of years, retiring as a general, but also you have a lot of flight time in variety of aircraft from the F-4 all the way up to the F-16. So how would you compare, if you even can compare, flying the PT-19 to some of those high-performance aircraft?
Actually, it doesn't compare because you can't light the burner and go fast. I started out, of course, like most Air Force pilots, in the T-37, the little twin-jet Cessna, which was a very easy airplane to fly, much like this is. Airspeeds weren't comparable. Of course, we'd go up to maybe 300 miles an hour. Gosh, gee whiz. This airplane is about a 100-mile-an-hour airplane, but it is very responsive. It's very agile, very nimble, trims easily, and is very stable. So it's really a joy to fly, a pleasure to fly. It's a simple airplane to fly in that it has a fixed pitch wooden propeller and non-retractable landing gear. So you don't have to manage anything except the RPM, or the manifold pressure on the engine, and the basic flying of it. But it is really a joy to fly it.
When you take it out on the road, obviously it is part of the rides program. Have there been any interesting passengers that you've been able to take for a flight?
No, when we had it on the road before the restoration, we, as you may realize, we did not know the history of this particular airplane. So we simply talked about the fact that it was a primary trainer and it was the first airplane that a young man would fly. Now that we know the history, of course, we'll make sure that people that get in this airplane know that they're really sitting in a really unique piece of history. There were thousands of airmen trained in World War II, but only hundreds of black airmen were trained. And this Tuskegee experiment that we talk about was really the start point of making the Army Air Forces understand the importance of a fully integrated flying force. Of course, you know all about the 332nd Fighter Group, later Fighter Wing, 99th Fighter Squadron, all those organizations. And in 1947, when President Truman issued the desegregation order, the Air Force, I'm proud to say, led the way in developing a truly integrated military establishment. And now we don't even use the word integration. We're just the U.S. Air Force.
Right. How many years were you in service?
How many years was I in the Air Force? 35.
35. And during that time, what were some of the big changes that you saw? Obviously, with hardware, moving from the F4 to the F-16 and beyond, but also within the Air Force itself.
Within the Air Force itself, well, we changed our structure several times. Obviously, we moved from a air division wing structure to a wing and numbered Air Force structure directly with no air divisions in between. I think we learned a lot about education and training, and we're learning more right now, as a matter of fact. We're introducing more and more simulation into pilot training, more and more virtual reality into maintenance training. So I think we're figuring out a lot of different ways to get more out of the young men and young women that we bring into the force. From the viewpoint of an old white man, I would say we're a completely ethnically integrated Air Force. We learned a lot as we came along, the value of different kinds of people, different kinds of perspectives, and you'd have to talk to a black airman or an Asian airman to see if my perspective is right. But I think that we do treat people with the proper dignity and respect, and we look at people's ability, what they can do, look at the mission and how they can support the mission. And from my viewpoint as a fairly senior commander, I'm not sure that I ever really cared about where a person came from in terms of ethnicity or background. I just wanted to see ability and get the job done.
That's great.
I hope I'm right.
When you take, I think you might be. I think you're onto something. When you take the airplane on the road, and you talk to young people, or actually any age person, how do you wrap the story of the PT-19 into and kind of draw the parallel to where the Air Force is today?
Well, if I get a chance to talk to young men in any particular detail, young men and young women in any particular detail, I try to emphasize to them that this airplane represents one small step in the advance of technology of aviation. And the reason we were able to move beyond basic airplanes like the PT-19 to airplanes like the current T-6 Texan that we're using for primary training is because we had smart people developing the science and technology required for aviation. I point out, too, that this airplane was designed without the use of computers. Every part on the airplane had to be drawn out on a light table by a draftsman and then manufactured with very little automation. And I show them the things that we built with lack of automation, like inside the wings, the pieces of plywood that had to be cut to precise specifications. And then tell them, now, if you really want to see aviation advance or aerospace advance, get into engineering, get into science, design things, show us the next generation. And hopefully that resonates, and hopefully they understand that.
Very good. What is in your experience? What is the best part of flying the PT-19?
The best part?
What's the best part? The part you enjoy the most?
Flying people and showing them what the airplane can do. I really enjoy flying people in the airplane and letting them see what an airplane is all about. Particularly people who have only flown in airliners and seen out that little bitty window out to the side. Now they can see the whole world and see what flying is all about. We really just focus on the the fun, the joy of flying, being free of the earth, being able to make the earth rotate.
So, General Harrison, we appreciate you taking some time to talk a little bit about the PT-19. I don't want to hold you up from going out and flying any longer than we have to, but also want to thank you not only for joining us, for your service, and also congratulations. You're a member of the Georgia Aviation Hall of Fame. Wanted to point that out before we let you go. Congratulations, sir. Thanks again for sharing your stories of the PT-19 and from Airbase Georgia.
All right. Thank you for having me.